Good evening, everyone. My name's Sabi, and I'm the Associate Director and Curator at the Ishara Art Foundation. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our second episode of Alt+Shift+Studio, Fractured Grids, which is the second season or the second edition of this online series. The first one that had taken place in 2020. And after a gap of a couple of years, we've resumed it this year. And for all of you who've joined, this is to let you know that the session is being recorded. I'm going to make a quick introduction. The layout of the program is going to be a brief introduction from my side, followed by a brief introduction about this particular edition and an introduction to our artist who's presenting today, Vikram Divecha, followed by a presentation by him in the form of a film. That'll be followed by Q&A. I'm going to start straight away with the introduction and then lay out the house rules after my introduction so that everyone who might have joined late can at least have an idea of the format and the code of conduct here. So Alt+Shift+Studio comprises of artist conversations and video tours that explore how contemporary artists redefine the idea of artist studio in the 21st century. The artists in the series are those with whom we've worked before and have developed prolonged conversations at the Foundation, and we're delighted to bring some of those conversations to you. An impulse behind this web series was to take the pulse of contemporary art practice through the ways in which infrastructures meet ideas. One could argue that the idea of a studio has undergone a radical change from what it signified in some parts of the world after the middle of the 20th century. It was initially a space of isolation in which artists drew from their inspiration and produced artworks. These are often pictured as large spaces, oftentimes stacked with canvases and sculptures, and a solitary male figure that looms large. But what if we were to say that that was a fantasy that is still perpetuated in art schools and in many parts of the world, and that modern and contemporary artists in most other parts of the world never really operated that way, even though they might have aspired to it? What if we were to say that an artist studio in Hong Kong had a unique relationship with the city, different from an artist studio in Lahore, Delhi, Shanghai, Hanoi, Dubai, Sharjah? And what if we were to say that each artist's practice produces a different image of the city because of the sites that their processes demand? What other image of the artist studio would we then carry? Another impulse of this series draws inspiration from an initiative conceived by Rux Media Collective titled Cityscape as part of the Sarai program in Delhi between 2010 and 2013. Between 2010 and 2013. Cityscape created context for high-intensity interdisciplinary processes at different locations in Delhi. Sometimes these processes were rendered as an exhibition, at other times as a gathering, as a library, as a temporary archive, or as an occasion for performances, conversations, and debates. At still other times, it took the form of a workshop, a temporary atelier, a media studio, a publication, or an online platform. So Alt+Shift+Studio, therefore, is a series of dialogues that takes place almost a decade after Cityscape was first begun. Many shifts have occurred in the field since then, and I hope that you'll find through the different presentations the changing contours of contemporary art practice. The studio as interface, the studio as a space of gatherings, the portable studio that moves with each residency program, and several more sites and improvisations will inform our discussions. Alt+Shift+Studio, as I mentioned, comprises of artist tours and conversations and videos. And I'm delighted that in this edition, we have a set of artists who are based between Jaffna, Srinagar, Sharjah, Dubai, Karachi, and many other locations simultaneously. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Himanshu to introduce this edition, the theme of this edition, and he's the curator behind this year's Alt+Shift+Studio. But before I do that, for everyone who's joined in the middle of my introduction, the session is being recorded. Any questions you might have, you can raise after the presentation by Vikram, and we'll have the floor open. You can put them in the Q&A column, and we will read them out for you, and Himanshu and Vikram will be moderating the discussion. So thank you everyone for joining, and over to you, Himanshu.
you, Sabi, for such a comprehensive introduction to Alt+Studio and for continuing the conversation around studios as a networks of sites. Many of our internet discussion led to think about a grid-like structure for our surroundings, right, which are not which are fragile and porous at the same time. For me, Alt+Studio reimagines contemporary practices that navigates between media and data. And I also think it's a platform that can respond to this shift. And it's a network of spheres of production and consumption. As a part of 2023 edition, Alt+Studio interrogates some of these questions through the theme of fractured grids. Now, when I was a student of archaeology, box grids was one of the technique for excavation that left a section of a site undisturbed and yet allowed us to see the deposits that are beneath it. Almost like using this box grid technique approach to the artistic studio practices, we can actually peek into the concepts of production, collaboration, friendships, and solidarity that exist within the artist practices. The notion of a grid implies endlessness, but at the same time, there's a sense of rigidity to it and structure. Now, grids also rationalize the control, exercise power, they expand, discipline, and also colonize, in spite of their open-ended nature. Fracture grids explore how artist practices are shaped both inside and outside of the studio spaces, and in a manner that offers multiple paths for navigation. This edition moves through the cities, including Jaffna, Karachi, Dubai, Sharjah, Abu Dhabi, and offering insights into how ecology, civil movements, war, and migration not only shapes contemporary art, but also offer nuanced ways to think about spaces where the art happens. Vikram's practice, which responds to the surroundings that are constantly evolving, transmitting, and creating sippages, almost producing a new terrain of urbanism. Rather than creating an image of a formation, a system that unravels multiple codes simultaneously. Now, where do we go for clues and different paths to understand this urban apparatus? With this, I would like to introduce Vikram. Vikram is a Beirut-born artist, educator who grew up in Mumbai and is based in the UAE. He holds an MFA in visual arts from Columbia University and was participant of the Whitney Museum's independent study program. Divecha's practice focusing on found processes, term that he uses to describe the urban operation he investigates and deploys. Found processes depends on forces and capacities at work within existing commercial and social structure that are in place in the Gulf region, ranging from the municipal gardening, wholesale exporting, railway scheduling, architectural services, demolition, and more. His work has been exhibited regionally and internationally at the 57th Venice Biennale, Biennale's UAE National Pavilion, and the 13th Sharjah Biennale, the Louvre Abu Dhabi and the Goethe Institute in Abu Dhabi, Jamilat Center in Dubai, Center for Contemporary Art, Warsaw, the Elizabeth Foundation of the Arts in New York. Divecha received grants and commissions and scholarships from Sharjah Foundation, the Arab Fund for Arts and Culture, Al Circle Avenue, Department of Culture and Tourism, Abu Dhabi, Institute for the Salma bin Hamdan Al Nahyan Foundation and Warehouse 421. He currently teaches at Adjunct Assistant Professor of Art and Art History at the New York University, Abu Dhabi. And now I would like to hand over to Vikram.
Thank you, Manju, for the lovely introduction and also for having me in this iteration of Alt+Shift Studios that you're curating. A big hello to everyone who has joined us today. I would like to mention that today's presentation has emerged from many conversations and brainstorming sessions I've had with Himanshu and Sabi. And their prompts and insights led me to focus on one work, which has been put together in a short video format. And I must credit Nikhil KC for putting this lovely presentation together. So I won't keep us waiting anymore, but let's get the presentation rolling, and I'll see you during the Q&A.
This book, Sylvie and Bruno Concluded, was authored by Lewis Carroll and was first published in 1893. Now, the theorist Stephen Wright refers to this book in his own work that is titled Toward a Lexicon of Usership. What interests Wright is a country map in the story which is made on a scale of a mile to a mile. That is a 1:1 scale map. In other words, a map the size of the country itself. Now, the characters in the story realize they don't have much use of such a large map. So instead, they consider using the country as its own map itself and engaging with the land on a 1:1 scale. Now, I am drawn to this idea of working on a 1:1 scale with the city. It's an approach that avoids metaphors, forms of representation, and forces one to negotiate with the city, create encounters to work with and through reality. Perhaps so that one arrives at a practice that doesn't differentiate between art and life. And I think this is what I constantly strive for. So I can say that Dubai, Sharjah, and Abu Dhabi have been my studios for many years now. I would often turn up at warehouses, workshops, and offices as an unexpected, or if I may say, an uninvited guest. Sometimes I was hosted, sometimes not. I had got this card printed at a small scale print shop. It's based on a common template used by industrial and commercial sectors over here. I remember the designer had a good laugh when we put this together. Maybe this was one of my earliest collaborations. The card invited a double take and was at times a conversation starter. There's a joy I find in meeting people in the city, turning up at their workspaces, introducing myself as an artist who has all these peculiar requests. These conversations would gradually lead to opening up gaps within these urban systems and finding ways to collaborate and work with available resources and skills that are constantly running the city. I was living in the UAE for a few years before I started making art, and I have witnessed the city's rapid development. The built infrastructure is, of course, of interest, particularly the underpass tunnels that feature elaborate tiling work. These are often decorated with images of state iconography, such as billowing flags, soaring eagles, voyaging dhows, infinite geometry, undulating calligraphy, and more. Embedded in the rapid development of transportation infrastructure is a celebration of nationalistic pride. Traditional themes escort you along these modern urban pathways. So I began looking at this tunnel while it was being tiled with an intricate mosaic pattern in the year 2014. I was keen to understand its design process. This underpass is a kilometer long and connects the Dubai financial district with the Business Bay area, which is next to downtown Dubai, an ultra modern retail, hospitality, finance, and residential hotspot. The tunnel runs along the route D86 that is currently known as Al Mustaqbal Street. Former names include first Al Khail Street, Al Sada Street, and even Happiness Street. Street names over here are also as transient. So it took them over 1 year to tile this entire tunnel. And it is an elaborate process which involves a lot of resources and operations. The tile pieces are cut and numbered, after which a team of workers spend many laborious months piecing together this enormous jigsaw puzzle. The outcome at times is reminiscent of centuries old forms of mosaic tile work used to decorate architectural landmarks such as the Alhambra. The difference here being that you drive past these mosaic, as against stand in front of them and marvel at the expertise in mathematics and craftsmanship. The traditional craftsmen are replaced by South Asian workers, who are easy to source in large numbers, which allows for the scale of such decorations. The grid is based on ready-made rectangular tiles that are sourced from Portugal. In this image, a small section of a yellow rectangular tile was cut out to be replaced with a smaller white triangular piece. The introduction of these unique cutout shapes disrupts the modernist grid with traditional patterns. These tiles are not cut on site. They arrive from a factory packed and labeled in segments or heaps. As you can see, the heaps vary in the number of tiles stacked. The numbers on the printed design plans correspond to the labeled tile numbers, which one must follow diligently to assemble the mosaic. The factory is where all the tile cutting takes place. There are multiple abrasive water jet cutters that spew a sand and water mixture, which makes the factory floor very dusty. The interlocking geometry is first mapped out on AutoCAD to create detailed diagrams for each heap. Then these paths are fed into the water jet cutters. The machine operators also refer to printouts as the water jets start running. They place rectangular tiles as per the colors indicated, running the path multiple times to create an interlocking jigsaw. The water jet cutters are a violent sight to watch. There is a relentless determination in them, which makes me think of how cities are replanned, realigned, and ripped through. Before one gets accustomed to a certain grid and order, it is butchered with another plan, another policy. As they cut the tiles, the waste bits are disposed. Each residual waste tile piece is a negative, a counterpart reminder of this process. I got interested in collecting these waste pieces, which are produced in large numbers at the factory. The operator collects the tiles in a neatly organized heap, which are then sorted and labeled at the factory. As you can see, multiple heaps are packed in a specific order before being sent to the underpass site. So this is a really important image. We are looking at the desktop computer of the designer who was responsible for orchestrating the entire operation of preparing vector plans and feeding the multiple water jet cutters on the shop floor. He was always busy, stressed, and working under crazy deadlines. And I had to make myself available, sit down in his office for hours to learn the details of the cutting process. My waiting without any hurry, I would say, perhaps introduced a different notion of time in his office, a philosophical time or reflective time that was unaffected by the stress of production. This has become essential to how I collaborate over the years. To wait and linger in these high stress environments and open up spaces where artistic engagement rather than just artistic production becomes possible. And it was only when his outdated rickety desktop computer crashed that we had time to engage. It would take a while to reboot the machine with the heavy AutoCAD files. This is when we had many conversations that went beyond the intricate design process. I'm reminded of the second camera in the courtroom from Kiarostami's film Close Up, where one could express things that are complex, private, and hard to explain. These spaces are crucial to open up, especially in a framework where one is expected to be constantly productive. So after more than 3 months of following the cutting process at the factory, I got access to collect the waste that would be generated from tile cuttings that would cover this vibrant wall section of 80 square meters titled LHS Unit 27. At the center of this section is a beige 10-pointed star surrounded by patterns in red, blue, green, yellow, white, and off-white. Over time, this detailed diagram that we are panning across became akin to a musical score for me, and it is only after I had understood the grammar of their process that I was prepared to collect all of the waste in a systematic manner. Firstly, the numbering system divides the design into 4 sections, titled 1, 2, 3, 4, separated here for your reference by the vertical and horizontal magenta lines. Here is a detail from section 1. Let's look at the bottom row, which is titled row C. We ascend in an alphabetical order, row D, row E, row F, and so on. While the rows are numbered alphabetically, the columns are numerical. So at the left of this image, we have column 17, followed by column 18, column 19, and so on. Here I've outlined in magenta to explain how the cutting process is divided into smaller segments. To the left of the outlined box is a complete blue tile. This needs no cutting at the factory. The next four rectangles numbered 24F, 25F, 26F, and 27F need to be composed of uniquely shaped blue, white, and beige tiles. These shapes are cut at the factory and packed and labeled as one heap. The following tiles are complete beige tiles, which again require no cutting. After this, the next unique section needs to be cut, which would comprise of unique shaped beige, white, and yellow tiles. Here I have outlined row D, which you will notice comprises of so many unique shapes. This explains why some heaps have a lot more tiles than others. As I understood this grammar, I found a lyrical rhythm and order in this process. It was a different kind of poetry that was fine-tuned by the repetition of operations expected from this industry. This is an initial proposal sketch where the waste tile pieces were to be placed within the confines of the rectangular grid. Perhaps it was influenced by how the heaps were packed at the factory. It is an unresolved moment I came across in my archives while preparing for this talk. The time had come where they were going to start cutting the large 80 square meter section. I had got extra diagram copies of each segment to be cut, which I placed inside a Ziploc bag. The operators also had similar printouts pinned near their machines, so we exactly knew which segment or heap was going cut, allowing me to collect the waste tile pieces in a systematic manner. I had arrived with close to 300 Ziploc bags. This was a few weeks of planning, which allowed me to align myself with the ongoing operations. This approach is a strategy I often apply to work with the available materials, space, and skill sets. There are so many resources that are constantly being deployed in the city, and it only makes sense to repurpose all this energy and material for creative use. One has to find ways to disrupt these systems with short circuits to explore new potentials. In a sense, I feel that an artist's job is to not mind their own business. I was on the factory floor collecting tiles for 2.5 days, from the morning and evening shifts, barely sleeping for a few hours in between. Throughout this, I remember the water jet cutters just never stopped ripping through the tiles. It was beyond the metaphor of cities and grids and urban replanning. Rather, this incessant operation of cutting seemed to be channeling the notion of a historic time that continuously inscribes ideologies into and through minds, civilizations, and eras. This cutting wasn't an operation from lived time. Rather, it was a force that butchered time itself, allowing only a fractured sense of self that one can emerge into. So this is a crucial moment in the process where the operators would leave the waste tiles on the side for me to collect. Otherwise, they would have trashed these tiles immediately. This was great because in the process, accidentally, some great patterns began to emerge. In the clinking of the tiles, I could hear the sweet chime of disorder. The grid was disrupted. I began to see the wings and beaks of birds of prey, the thous of sails, geometric calligraphy, and so much more. This moment of abstraction gave birth to so many ideas. This is when I'm reminded of how one must constantly be in tandem with one's subject to arrive at some understanding of his nature and potentials. The art historian D.D. Huberman speaks of the temptation to immobilize seeing and the object of seeing. Like the entomologist, Who pins a dead butterfly to a corkboard to study it with a gaze that is as dead as the butterfly itself? Rather, one must learn to look and study the butterfly without compromising its freedom of movement. Let it remain unstoppable and unpredictable. One must learn to dance with the butterfly. Perhaps dancing with your subject is a way of thinking about working on a 1:1 scale. And so I collected waste tile pieces in hundreds of Ziploc bags in a systematic order based on the factory's numbering system. This image clearly reveals how the diagram and tile pieces correlate. Verde is green in Spanish. So in the diagram, the large tile 64C has a small triangular section cut off from its top left, which is the little green piece in the heap. The next green tile 63C has another waste tile counterpart in the heap. This image shows the segment details from the design plans. And this image gives you the large picture. This heap was from section 1. There was another important site in the development of this work. The artists Mohammad Kazim and Christiana Di Marchi were kind enough to lend me their studio, where I sorted through and organized all of this material. Here is where I could reflect on the systematic grammar of this urban process and make it the basis for my own visual grammar. Here I was riffing off someone else's poetry to develop my own. There was an elegant formal tension between the rectangular grid and the diagonal intrusions. At times, it took me back to two distinct visual languages I grew up amidst. My late father was an architect, and my mother, now retired, was a textile designer and educator. He drew freehand lines fluently, straight, parallel, or perpendicular, and she would twirl the pencil to give birth to eloquent cursive shapes. So I hand numbered each tile piece so that I could identify it with a specific heap. For some reason, I left aligned all of the work as I arranged it on the studio floor. I suppose I did that because I write from left to right, as against Arabic, which is from right to left. It is difficult for me to reflect on this work now, as I'm no more caught up within the process of thinking it through. More like how one gets caught up in cities that overwhelm you and demand complete involvement. I've grown up in Mumbai and Beirut, and I've always been taken aback with how exhaustingly they embroil you. Perhaps tragically, I seek this kind of involvement in my own work. This reminds me of a quote by the choreographer Jeffrey Daniel, who speaks about how James Brown and Michael Jackson dance. Daniel says, they don't dance to the music, they dance inside the music. The phrase inside the music has been so crucial for me. To involve yourself so much that you are literally inside the situation. The studio allowed me to develop a detailed install process for which I have created a 23-page document. This is quite a painful read, and we don't have to go through it all. In short, you begin with a temporary grid created with threads and masking tape. The document comes with these charts that tell you where each heap must be placed. I had customized boxes prepared which pack each heap. The box is labeled with section, row, and column number. In a way, this was an elaborate archiving of waste. I often work with waste and refuse and bring it back into circulation. The anthropologist Mary Douglas posits that dirt is matter out of place. I'm interested in these disruptive politics of bringing that into attention, which is meant to be erased. Perhaps that's why I have so obsessively catalogued these tiles. Amongst many things, this work crucially indexes the labor that goes into this decorative process, and it only deserves all this effort to preserve it. The boxes are placed into specific slots within the thread grid, where the tiles are unpacked and installed in heaps. After the install is done, the threads and tape are carefully removed. One thing that bothered me was that I was referencing or thinking about art movements such as suprematism and such while installing in the studio. To break this, I invite someone who is not from the visual arts to install the work. The installer must place the tiles within the given slot, but has a freedom to create their own designs and arrangements. There's a playful joy when it comes to working with such basic forms and color. To balance the heap out, the larger tile pieces must be placed at the bottom. The tiles are left loose, creating these precariously balanced structures. This project is not a great example of how deeply I involve collaborators, but shifting agency and opening outcomes beyond my control is an approach I'm very much invested in. So that's the final install view. The work is titled Negative Heaps of Designated Waste. It was first shown in 2015 in the exhibition titled A Public Privacy, curated by Cristiano Di Marchi and Mohammad Kazem under the initiative UAE Unlimited, which supports emerging artists in the region. These tiles also traveled to Poland, where they were exhibited at the Center for Contemporary Art in Warsaw. I'd even created a paper cutting workshop for these young visitors. Perhaps this work is an image of the dense and chaotic cities I grew up in, Beirut and Bombay, precarious and always on the edge. But I'm interested in the way people shape cities. Through improvisation and acts of placemaking, they create a sense of belonging. Within Dubai's vertically stacked microcosms, I've seen how gradually residents have, through small gestures, shaped their neighborhoods. The work was recently shown at Gallery IVDE in the year 2021. It was during the install process that I realized that this work has gone through three different iterations. It was installed differently each time. This led to a new work, a way of transforming and riffing off my own work. I selected a few heaps and had their shapes cut out in matching colored paper. Each shape was cut in multiples. I then invited a team of framers I work with to create their own version of patterns. The same shapes, but the patterns are different. The outcomes have a visual joy. Some of them remind me of vintage jazz covers. I named this series Improvisations, a return to movement and music. And I love this idea of movement. Keep things moving, never static.
Thank you, Vikram. This was extraordinary to put together this kind of a film and a presentation about your studio. Just to give everyone a context of how we decided to present this specific project by Vikram in the Alt+Shift+Studio series is that when we approached Vikram to invite him to participate in this edition, we already knew that here's an artist who's dealing really with all kind of scalar expansions and contractions, all kinds of processes that make a city. And so his studio, therefore, is a constantly shifting site of processes or what he calls found processes that are inhabited by other people, and then he comes into that process, and a work emerges from that. And so what confounded us over the few meetings and conversations we had with Vikram was that each project was practically like a different improvisation of the studio itself. There was no fixed studio. The studio itself was an improvisation from project to project to project. And that was a very interesting kind of revelation for us. There was no place that he goes back and processes all of this stuff. It's based on the nature of the project. It's based on the nature of choreography that he described that leads to what the studio will be. And so it creates the studio not so much as a spatial kind of an entity, as much as a temporal one, as much as a chance encounter one, as much as a collaborative space being produced based on many people's work and many people's labor. And that, I think, was a fascinating process. We're going to have Q&A now, but I want to add a comparison of the previous artist that we presented in this series, Zainab, who is an artist based in Srinagar, and she's also a journalist. And for her, she described the studio as, or her studio as, the home, her office, and everything in between. It just so turns out that when she's based in Srinagar, everything in between looks like a very different landscape from what we're looking at here. It's a landscape that has beautiful scenery, but also a lot of military barricades, a lot of checkpoints, a lot of things that go into a military occupied state. In a place like the UAE, the cityscape that emerges in Vikram's practice is one that is going through constant transformation. And I think Vikram's practice is trying to put a finger on that, on those transformations and the various infrastructural procedures that go into it. So on that note, we're going to open it out for Q&A, and Himanshu is going to be, I think, leading the way for some of the questions around fractured grids and Vikram's practice. Anyone who has questions in the audience, please put them in the Q&A section or in the chat section, and we read them out along the way. Over to you, Himanshu.
For like opening up the conversation. And Vikram, I think the presentation, I think all of us must have understood the kind of scale, or not just in a sense of the landscape and the site, but I think at the scale of operations, which often get sidelined while speaking about art practices. So it was such a poetic hybrid way of looking at things. So thank you for that.
Right.
I would like to kind of begin with our multiple conversations in the past, but I think in your presentation, you discuss the scale of operations for 1-to-1 aspect ratio. By scaling up, the paradigm of spectatorship changes. So how does the city as a studio mean to you? Like what actually it means to you in the context of not having just the participants in your studio, but participants as spectators as well? How do you define that?
Yeah, that's thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me, and yeah, to come back to this question about the participants becoming spectators. Well, I think for first thing that I'm interested in is that, when does the move towards it being perhaps an art object, or a move towards having some sort of cultural sort of value happen, and I feel like, in a sense, yeah, for me, like the spectatorship, or the sort of shift in how we are looking at this process as something that is artistic should happen in a collaborative way. For me, that move is really important. And this is not the best case example of the works, but what really excites me is that that through working with these practitioners, with these collaborators who have slowly allowed me to enter, their spaces, we start revisiting what they are doing. For me, like, I think about this term riyaz, which is practice, that all of these, if you want to call them workers or skilled laborers, every day they are conducting a form of practice. It's a kind of riyaz, and for me, it's also about how do I acknowledge that they are also creative practitioners. And when you slightly shift that position, which happens through this ongoing engagement. Um, in a sense, there's also a sense of ownership and claiming that happens on that work. And what I also seek is not just a participation, but I seek an aesthetic participation. So there are instances, again, where I've been working with the gardeners, for example, that they really take over the work and it becomes their work. And for me, that residue, I would say that is like, I would say, a cultural residue of our engagement, right? And for me, that is, I would say that is the cultural product of that, say, moment, right? That residue is what is the magic out there, which for a temporary time binds us, which brings us together, you know? And for me, there's just something very beautiful, and that sort of is when, you through collaboration, you just kind of realign how we look at, say, tiling in a factory or landscaping in a city, you know, and those open up new spaces and conversations. And then, of course, the work comes into the context of, say, the gallery or cultural sector. And I think that's the second audience there. You know, sometimes it's not even important for me that the work gets witnessed. Rather, the work perhaps is, as you mentioned, that they become the spectators of their own work. They become the viewers of their own work. You know, and I haven't found a way to actually frame that. You know, so I'm glad you asked that question. But for me, that's perhaps a far more important cultural residue of this engagement. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Yeah, thank you. That was very comprehensive. I think it allowed us to actually look at, you know, when you think about participants and spectatorship, how it kind of comes together quite eloquently. I think I again want to go back to the first image that you had shown in the presentation, which is Lewis Carroll's. But this time I want to refer to another book, which is the most famous one of Alice in Wonderland. But you know, where the scale constantly changes throughout the storyline, right? So can you describe the aspect in your storyline projects, such as we do, which narrates the story via an AutoCAD file to the Gulf aesthetics of remittance in Kerala? So in this case, where would you situate a studio?
Okay. This is going to be a slightly long answer. Very briefly, what Himanshu is discussing is about an ongoing project since 2016, where I have been looking at how Gulf remittances from the UAE, from the Gulf region to Kerala, the flows of money is producing a certain kind of architecture, right, which is very influenced by the Gulf aesthetics and aspirational lifestyles of this part of the world. And what we've been witnessing is these homes are imitating villas you see in the UAE. And what I did for that project was and still I'm working on it, is I followed on AutoCAD the story of an architect in Kerala designing a house for someone in the UAE. And so I have like literally hours and hours of footage, which I'm still trying to sort through, which literally is looking at the operation or the process of designing itself. So in this case, the studio, if you want to, since this is the term we're looking at, the studio for me is actually not even the computer screens where it is being designed. The studio is literally the exchange between the client who is in Sharjah and the architect who is working from Kerala. And there is this constant back and forth that is happening to them through these AutoCAD and PDF files, right? And I have somehow managed to insert myself in this sort of, invisible process and witness how a house is designed. And what has emerged is like my initial impetus was to work on a film that, is looking at these aesthetics that are being, or aspirational aesthetics that are surfacing in Kerala. But what I've realized over the process, over the course of time, is a very process of designing a house itself, of working on floor plans itself, is your first sight of imagination, is your first sight of, say, entering, it's a way of perhaps entering from the imaginative into the symbolic order. And the floor plan itself becomes a site for performativity, a form of masculine performativity itself, which I suddenly became a preview 2, which has now shifted what my film is going to be about. So after like 6 years, I'm abandoning my original impetus and in a sense going back about this idea of dancing with the butterfly, that I am rethinking what this film is about. So the studio literally is, actually the studio essentially is basically me, perhaps the studio actually is me getting preview into someone imagining and working through their own psychological tensions of working in the UAE, but having this very difficult relationship between trying to reclaim a masculinity when they return to India. So I've entered many more spaces through a sort of a dynamic floor plan. And I don't think I can call this a studio. I think this is something else,
The idea of authorship, right? That's we've been constantly
So can you repeat that?
No, I said that it's kind of referring again back to the idea of authorship that came back throughout the conversation. Now, moving forward, I want to bring another work of yours, which has again the sense of multiple authorship, but like I want to refer to Dohrana, in which like the verses from the poem turns into greenscapes and landscapes as per you. So, in what ways does this kind of translate the concept of authorship? I think that's what even Sabi was asking, that each of your project almost becomes the idea of multiplicity of authorship. So how do you deal with that in this case, in this particular case?
Yeah, I think so. So Himanshu is referring to the Dohrana film I made recently with a few municipal gardeners in Sharjah, and I've been working with them since 2014. This is my longest collaboration. To give you a very brief history, it began with a small project in 2014 where I did drawing workshops with them, and they designed their own hedges, which they didn't deploy. They deployed these patterns in a public park where they work. And in fact, they actually, it was supposed to be 3 for 4 months, but they maintained those designs for at least 5 years, only until COVID is when that got disrupted. And then I did a project for the Sharjah Biennial with them, which was about these gardeners actually are farmers from Pakistan, and they flew back to Pakistan through my Sharjah Art Foundation grant. And they brought back heirloom seeds, and they created an urban farm in a roundabout. And it took me 2 years to realize this project. And by the time I was studying my master's, all my work happened actually over WhatsApp. And that's when I realized that our engagement through poetry, through Urdu, was echoing this idea of poetry, so the gardeners, so I think that to go back, I think that within the collaboration, it's also how the gardeners slowly kind of rethought who I was. Because when I first went to them in 2014, they thought like, I was a landscaping designer, or I was someone in agriculture, I was someone, some kind of a contractor. And it took a while for all of us to understand, for them also to kind of say, okay, this is actually an aesthetic endeavor. And so now they are completely on board with me. And our last project, Dohrana, actually emerged from Shabir, who was one of the gardeners, who has a penchant for Urdu poetry. And we began reflecting on the roundabout landscape, the farming project, through Urdu poetry. And for me, this was actually a way of even rethinking, how I engage and make a transformation of how I engage with the gardeners. Because in a sense, I was still working within their sites, right? That within the landscaping site or within the roundabout site. And this was a bigger leap that we took, where Shabir's was writing and developing ideas for poems which were reflecting on themes of, hunger, farmers' rights, and longing and migration. And these are, of course, very pertinent themes which were a way of thinking about the roundabout. And I think that it had come to a point where, I'd known them long enough that they were not just participants, but rather they were, active authors in this relationship, right? And I feel like that's the difference where, in a sense, if I could say, often you have participatory art where you create a certain system and you invite people to, say, a gallery or an institution to participate in the work. Whereas what I think I do is I reverse that and say, you know what, I'm going to go and participate in the public, right? And I get rejected, I get accepted, or those encounters produce new forms of collaborations, right? So I would never call myself or any of these endeavors as a collective. Rather, these are kind of differences. There are these forms of differences through which some sort of overlaps happen, right? And they happen during my engagement, and it happens because I'm stepping in over there, and then we create a space within which, uh, you know, um, I think authorship gets shifted. And I think that I also want to mention one more thing is because, in a sense, what I'm also doing is I'm also putting pressure on systems to open up gaps, and because I get, say, what I call commissioned by Shah Jahan Foundation, I can perhaps open up a gap within the municipal system, right? That's how I would use my commissioning sort of, access, or what kind of access it gives me. And once you open up this gap, then everyone has agency within that. So for example, when I was working with the gardeners, the very first project, I said, like, you know what, I'll be able to reshape these hedges. That's the broader idea. If you guys are on board, then we can initiate it. So they realized that I have some sort of leeway to make some realignments within the processes out there. So the very first thing they insisted was that we do not want to cut the hedges for 4 to 5 months. We want to kind of put manure, let them grow unruly. And after that, they'll be really lush. So when we put our designs, they will look much more elegant. So even before any of the interventions I could introduce, they already were claiming an authorship and spaces within the gap I'd opened up. So for me, in a sense, I'm not just trying to engage with labor, but rather I want to open up gaps within systems. And then as the way I engage with my collaborators, they realize there's an opening out here. And that's when other possibilities open up. So if that's the way perhaps to kind of think about, one is allowing authorship, but allowing what kinds of authorship are possible, because they understand the municipality much more than I do. I hope that answers your question.
More complex. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I said now you kind of ventured into such a complex apparatus of bureaucracy, and allowing these new formations to happen is something really appreciated. Now I think because almost 3 questions were kind of referring to authorship. Like now I want to go back to another probably your latest and much more like magnum opus project, like where you're proposing the Museum of Walls. As a performance, like walls are as a performance object, right? Like they themselves are the markers of time. They're constructed, shaped, they're demolished. So could you please discuss more on the idea of enclosures in the midst of this wall? Because they kind of creates a new ecosystem, right? Especially since many of these walls were once create a separation between the interior and the exterior. From your museum, would you kind of render them as artifacts, or what? Like, how would you kind of term them? Because it's a very complex set of project that you kind of propose.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't have all the answers right now, but just to briefly mention to all our viewers that Himanshu is referring to a project I'm proposing, which is called Wall House, where I want to extract walls from buildings that are going to be demolished and collect these sort of fragments that are otherwise deemed to be urban waste. It's not a historic wall. It's something that's going to be erased and forgotten. And someone today morning, in fact, George, saying that, yeah, like in a sense, you want to create a dustbin, you want to pick up things from the dustbin of history. And I think that's where the work is, that in a sense, how do we bring this sort of monumental thing back into circulation and deal with it, right? That as I mentioned also, Mary Douglas's quote about dirt is matter out of place. So I managed to remove my first wall in Abu Dhabi, and it's an interior wall, which basically has imprints of time from the migrants who lived out there. And it's a 7-ton humongous structure, which now we all need to deal with. And so what I'm proposing is to create a new community around this wall. So right now I'm conducting research. If I'm answering your question, Himanshu, I'm conducting research with different professors, researchers, and students who are converging from different disciplines on the wall. And perhaps they will create, the endeavor is that we create some forms of scholarship. Do we look at the question of, say, rent and the load of rent that we have? Do we look at the question of, say, how migrant identities are shaped when they come to a place like the UAE, or how identities get shaped as we move around? Do we look at the history of architecture and awnings and sort of decorative patterns? There's so many, or like the infrastructure of the Ethernet, which thinks about how we digitally connect, which is embedded within these walls. So all of the wall as a witness to so many different social, political, economic sort of histories. And how do we unpack these? And then how do we, over say a course of a year or two, and in doing so, we create a new community around that wall. Right, so the wall now is claimed not just by the landlord or the tenant, but the wall also has a relationship with, say, a researcher, a student, a capstone project. And then what I want to do is I want to get this wall to perform literally. So the way I've designed the wall is we can take it with a forklift or a crane, and we can say, take it from, say, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and we bring it over here, and we have a performance around the wall, which perhaps, say, it's exploring a piece of theater piece, where the wall is a backdrop and there's a theater piece which is exploring this question of rent, right? That the 7-ton wall, the metaphor of the weight of rent somehow reflects in the 7-ton wall that's standing behind us. And rent is like a global, whatever, it's a global sort of, understanding that we all have. So what I'm now proposing is that, can I get walls from different parts of the world? And it's a very difficult question I'm asking, because in a sense, this project already is haunted by the histories of, of colonial histories of, extraction and sort of transportation and musification. But at the core, what there are two things I would like to mention. One is that this project also draws from my own history as a migrant who came to the UAE. And there's something about when you get dislocated from your, say, given context, is there's a new way of reflecting on yourself. And there's a rethinking of what your identity is. And I feel like that's been very crucial for me in this part of the world, for so many other people who have known over years out here. And for me, in a sense, removing this wall from its original context, which also will get erased and forgotten, and bring it into, say, a cultural context, is a way of thinking, what else can that wall be? And beyond, I think I could continue with this, but I feel like, it's a longer discussion. I hope that answers your questions. But beyond that, there's also a very simple gesture of showing dignity towards the lives of people that get erased and forgotten. And so holding onto the wall is not just about memory and nostalgia, it's a way of showing dignity, I feel. This is actually something understood from the crane operator who removed the wall from me. And I'm actually understanding what this wall means as I'm having all these multiple conversations.
I really wanted to kind of refer to exactly the story that you just spoke about, like the crane operator.
Sorry, so, okay. Okay, so you want to go through that? So essentially, I managed to pull out a wall in Abu Dhabi in October last year, and I got permissions to stop. The building was half demolished, and I got permissions from Abu Dhabi Culture to somehow get the municipality to stop demolishing the wall. And the way it works is that I've worked with some structural engineers, and we built this metal frame around this wall, and we bolted the wall into this metal frame. And then there's like these hooks on which a crane is holding onto the frame. And then we start cutting the wall off with these really giant rotor blades. And when it gets cut off, the wall is dislodged and is going to hang from the crane. And the crane operator then, it's at the mercy of the crane operator how the wall is brought down. And I was really nervous that this crane operator might just take this thing, thinking the demolition site is all this waste out, he just might bring it down. And that would just waste the entire effort. You could just crack and break the thing. And nobody was giving me any assurance because this was a complete experiment that no one had done before, although we had all the resources, machines, and people, but nobody was giving me an assurance. And I brought the crane operator 2 days before. I explained him everything. And at the moment came when the wall was going to be dislodged, and he could still see me. I was extremely nervous because this was a moment when this remains as a fragment, or it just kind of becomes urban debris. And this crane operator came and told me that Vikram Bhai, he saw me, I was nervous. Okay, Vikram Bhai, Vikram Bhai, aap fikr mat karo. He says that, dear Vikram, my friend, do not take all this stress. Do not get stressed out. That मैं समझता हूँ कि ये दीवार किसी की कहानी है. That I understand that this wall is someone's story. और हमें इसे बचा के रखना है. That we have to protect this wall. And then they cut it, and the wall was dangling on his crane. And he so slowly, I was looking at him, and that's when all the machines were silent. He so slowly picked up the 7-ton thing with his 50-ton crane, and he slowly kind of brought it down, and we all are looking, and it's almost like time was suspended, and everybody's just watching this thing, and it came down. And I was just blown by this moment, because here was someone that was cradling this wall like a mother cradling a child with that crane. And here was someone who had no relationship with that wall, but he was showing this almost paternal affection towards this really humongous object. And this is when I realized that, yeah, like at the core, beyond the many things I'm discussing, there's a dignity in preserving these walls. And I think perhaps that's the best peer review I got, ever. And to be honest, there are days when I wake up and think like, this is a ludicrous sort of project you're envisioning, and I should just kind of go and make some watercolor paintings. But when I look at this moment, I feel there is something I'm trying to pursue, which I feel I will only understand it by having all these conversations and engagements, which might tell me what the work is eventually. I'm just kind of following an instinct right now.
Yeah, no, I think I wanted to bring this a specific question, like a specific answer that you basically just gave, because I think it gives a very like a claim of authorship in your work by multiple people. I think that's where we wanted to speak about studios as networks of sites. That's where people who want to be participants and spectators and involved very much into the whole process itself and to the last outcome. And I know we have multiple questions, but and was almost limited on time. So Sabi, can I request you to read some questions and also give your inputs into it?
Sure. Thanks so much, and thank you, Vikram. Fantastic. Something that me, my colleagues, all of us have been increasingly aware of as we were shaping Alt+Shift+Studio is that from the older idea of studios and exhibitions, the chronology seems to be broken in contemporary art practice. How? Because earlier, at least with modernity, a work used to get made in the studio. Once it is made, it gets installed in an exhibition, which is already realized, and then the exhibition is open to public. Now, with that chronology sort of broken or misaligned, what happens is even the artist gets to see their work for the very first time in the exhibition. So the exhibition sometimes serves as the first place where artwork gets made and presented simultaneously. So the artists themselves sometimes see the work for the very first time in the exhibition, because before the exhibition, it was disassembled in so many different processes and formats. So it's very much evident in your practice as well, Vikram. But over and above that, I think what's interesting is that it's in a constant state of flux. It's in a constant state of process and becoming. And your work keeps translating into new formats. I had a very small question, and you have to answer it briefly because we're running short of time. Where is that wall right now?
The wall is in a storage space in Abu Dhabi.
Okay, which is also then very interesting because
it's in a
sorry, it's in a
it's in a giant warehouse with a lot of stuff out there.
Okay. Okay.
And it's already becoming its own site. Like it's
Fantastic.
I'm enjoying taking people out there.
So even as we started conversations with Vikram for the Alt+Shift+Studio series, first we met in the Ishara space, then we were invited to another space, then we were invited to another warehouse where he unpacked some works and where some of the works were stored, and now he's talking about another space where this large wall is stored. So clearly it is very literally a network of sites where storages, processes, and exhibition makings are taking place in a kind of playlist shuffle kind of mode. I think many times a question that gets asked to Vikram is, how does he define authorship, and in this case, how does he define a studio? And it's very clear that there's no standard answer. It will keep changing from project to project. And this is a question that actually Isabel, who's in the audience today, has asked. I think Vikram has answered it, but I still want to give Vikram a chance if he wants to answer. And the question is, how do you deal with authorship, Vikram? Might it be confusing on some occasions? But if you have a brief answer for this, maybe you could quickly say something, and then we'll move to a couple more questions that have been asked.
So very briefly, I'm interested in the moment when people start claiming the work. For me, that's when sort of it's alive. And very briefly, like in 2014, I was working on this project called Boulder Plot. I was working with a rock blasting engineer, and he put my sketch on his sort of gray board with all his receipts and all. And he said, this is my work as well. And that was an amazing moment for me, and I have a photograph of that somewhere. I think that I'm looking at investment, right? Aesthetic investment. That is beautiful for life, forget my work or whatever.
Thank you. I'm going to ask some more questions from the audience. I hope everyone doesn't mind staying on for another 10 minutes. We started it a bit late as well because we were waiting for audience members to arrive. So there's a question from Richie Bhatia. In studio as a city, how do you see the element of chance and encounter and gender within your art practice?
So I think that chance and encounter is something extremely crucial because when I step out over there, like for example, the wall extraction project, it's for the last 10 years I've been trying to extract a wall. And it's only last year that I finally found one demolition contractor who was, completely on board with it. Right now he's sending me pictures of other buildings. He's like, this is beautiful wall out there. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And I feel that I strongly feel that as an artist, and I think I mentioned that some in the presentation, that you shouldn't be minding your own business, right? And it's not that I'm going to go and so I think that there is like a certain freedom I take. If you think about the idea of like creative freedom, that this is a creative freedom in terms of there's a storyline shift in a script or whatever. For me, the creative freedom is what are the freedoms that you can take in the city by going in there as an artist. A lot of my work, initial work, was also just gestures in the city, were not even commercial objects. They just disappeared out there, right? So I feel I have, and that's, I would say, a way of claiming the city, right? And within that, chance and encounters are part of it, but it's a way of me, perhaps it's a way of placemaking for my own self in the UAE, that how do I claim the UAE as my place? And I'm trying to kind of make this a little more broader umbrella. Like there was this term that we use in India called Aflatun. I never knew what this word meant, but as a kid, we kept using it, Aflatun. This guy's Aflatun, that guy's Aflatun. I only slowly realized as growing up that Aflatun actually means platoon or Plato. It came from the Middle East into like India through Arabic and Urdu and came into a public discourse. That Aflatun actually means Plato, and it's about like how it's not even Plato but Socrates and such philosophers were out there in the public practicing their philosophy in the public and asking questions to random bystanders, and perhaps advancing on what philosophy means in living in the world. And so for me, that chance and encounter is part of me trying to practice my philosophy with this city. And in that, also there'll be rejections, acceptances, relationships, tensions. I mean, I also have some fraught relationships with some people because they feel I'm stepping into their area but then they slowly understand that, no, hold on, and it's changed over time, so I think if that answers broadly the idea of chance and encounter through this broader idea of claiming a place. And gender, I think that's a great question, because in a sense, I've been thinking a lot about this over the last few years. I feel that I think the first thing is also my own gender of being in the UAE as a migrant. It's before even I think about the people I work with. It's about what does it mean to be, and there are kind of really deep hierarchies in the UAE based on class, based on your identity and nationality, or how you portray yourself. Those things are extremely, and those things get performed. So like even when I'm working in the municipality, like there's a gardener, there's a supervisor, area supervisor, there's an engineer, and there's someone above them. And that whole, there's a whole performativity that goes on. And I have to really negotiate it in the most diplomatic way, because I don't want to sort of, disturb that balance, right? I'm not trying to, create friction, because eventually I will step out of that place, right? So I'm very aware about that I sort of create this sort of, I'm sort of working with that arrangement of things. And so that comes to the question of me being sort of being a male, and also then the kinds of access I get over here is also largely male spaces, right? So in fact, just 2 days ago, I was in the office of Abu Dhabi municipality, right? And there was a very tight elevator. And I always was wondering, should I enter the elevator with the lady or not? Right? I wouldn't have this question if I'm kind of in a commercial office building or a mall out here, right? So these things also come into play. For some reason, a lot of my engagements have happened with largely male collaborators, but there have been female collaborators as well. I do not specifically go out looking for a specific gender. Rather, I'm trying to kind of look at a certain process or operation. And these processes are largely, I get exposed to a lot more male members than female members. But I think that within this, there's also a reflection of even my own, gender itself, which is now coming through the film of Vida, which I'm developing. That, what does it mean to perform as a male through this notion of design and architecture, right? It'll be very difficult for me that that I want to work with, say, like if that I want to work with, say, domestic workers. Then it becomes like a really kind of clear thing that I'm addressing a gender as against I'm addressing an industry, and I haven't approached my work in that manner. But beyond that, I must also say that I have had some amazing encounters with also women who run or work in these spaces. And they have given me different kinds of access, in industries or workshops and such. But it is just that there's a big imbalance in the UAE, and I feel in a sense my work also addresses that imbalance. Some of my work with the gardeners, especially the Dorana film, is a way of echoing how so many men live away from their families out here. There are these poems on longing and wanting to go back and meeting their lover, which also then echoes on, how also a lot of men find kinship out here, right? And it's very difficult to express this in blatant ways in the work we produce. Or at least, like, I do not want to kind of, I will only sort of be open to how someone is comfortable expressing these ideas. So those questions do come in. But since I do not work in private spaces, I work in public spaces, I need to be cognizant of what kind of questions I ask over there. I'm also always working in somebody else's place, right?
Yeah, and clearly they are gendered spaces in specific kinds of formations and social formations particularly. I'm going to club the next two questions because they're by the same person, and this will be our last question for today. So thank you everyone who stayed on this long. It's a question by Snehal More, and Snehal says, thank you for acquainting us with your practice. I've come across numerous writings by theatre professionals and have been fortunate enough to attend plays where the narrative of the actual performance or a novel unravels concurrently, unveiling the journey of encountering and embracing what eventually transforms into a work of art. Your video presentation rekindled the delight of experiencing this process. Given that the process itself often embodies the practice, I'm curious about how you identify yourself as an artist, writer, creator, orchestrator, or choreographer. There's a word "or" in there, and we may also think about the word "and" in there somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really great. I'm just gonna have a read it again.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think maybe like I would say that reflecting on what you have done, like what I did today, was really helpful in perhaps having a remove from my own self and looking at what was going on. I think I like the idea of I think somewhere between a choreographer and a catalyst is I would say is the central energy of what I'm doing. I think I'm glad you point out the question as the words as create an artist or writer, because I do come from a writing and filmmaking background. So I feel that in a sense, one could say that I'm a choreographer of real stories in the world, right? That stories that get shaped by my own movement in the city, right? That the narrative thread is my own sort of movement out there. And I feel that that movement has a certain energy to it. And so, I mean, I think that such presentations become very essential for the work itself. And so I'm interested, and I'm interested in this idea of, I mean, these words are really great because I feel that the choreography is something that, reminds me of a script, right? That you sort of, you have a certain timeline of events, and within that, you open up these gaps and spaces for various kinds of performances or participation. So in a sense, yeah, I think I would say that this idea of choreography and story and narration is, I would say, a temporal way of looking at it. But I'm deeply interested in conceptual art and conceptual interventions. I'm deeply interested in collaborations forms. So I don't have a specific answer for this. Yeah.
But I do think that your practice and many others that we're looking at increasingly are not operating in categories that are singular. It is this and this and this and this, and sometimes the practices are conjunctions for various kinds of authorships or roles rather than segregations. I think an older notion tried to segregate the definition of what one is doing. And increasingly, it's not segregating roles as much as creating concurrent roles and conjunctions in roles. Yeah.
In fact, as you say that, I'm just thinking about the fact that it's given at times it's only possible that we all have multiple windows open, and other windows keep
on a browser,
opening.
exactly.
And I feel like in a sense, in a similar sense, that's how I'm negotiating with the city. I do not have one window open. I am sort of, and then every encounter opens up multiple windows, and at some point I crash as well, but that's all right.
Beautiful. Actually, a beautiful way to close, especially since your presentation closed, or some of the Q&A closed with a large wall, and now we're closing with a window in that wall. I wonder if you're going to be breaking any walls down and preserving windows in those walls and what those are going to look like. But on that note, thank you very much, Vikram. This was illuminating, absolutely. And I think it was literally a window into a very expansive practice. And it was really thought stimulating throughout the process to have finally decided this one project that will illustrate the complexity of what a studio means in a practice such as yours. As we conclude today's session, for all of those who attended, a big thank you to you as well. Our next episode is going to be with an artist who's based in Jaffna, Jasmine Ilani Joseph, and her presentation in this session is going to take place on the 7th of July. So I hope you'll join us for that. A few other thank yous must go out to colleagues who are behind the scenes, not visible. My colleague Asavri Sehgal, my colleague Manmita Shetty and Santosh, who've also been helpful in Asavri in terms of outreach, Manmita in terms of some of the logistics, and Santosh as well. Also a big thank you and shout out to Nikhil Casey, who edited the video. I hope you enjoyed the episode. The recording is going to go online in a week's time. And this video presentation that Vikram created along with Nikhil is going to independently float as well. So some of you can catch that too. On that note, there are a few other questions, but I'm sorry, but we really have to close now because we're really running late. So thank you again. And Vikram is going to be accessible. I think your email is probably on your website. So if you want to have any questions to him, please post them.
All right.
Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone, as well.
Okay. Bye.